Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this podcast. Australia's security agencies, ASIO and the Australian Signals Directorate, have long been warning about the fact that Australians, not people from overseas, are individuals that need to be looked at because of a rise in extremist ideologies, the right wing extremism. Terrorism is no longer associated with merely Salafi jihadists or global jihadists, people who believe in the sort of ideologies of ISIS and Al Qaeda. The challenge for us in Australia and also globally is to understand that these uh, groups, terrorist organisations, illicit networks, call them what you will, are interconnected. In order to explain this a bit more and explain why right wing extremism is a real danger, I've got an expert on the line today. Mollie Saltskog is a senior intelligence analyst with the world renowned Soufan Group, Soufan Center, and she's going to take us through what right wing extremism is, how it manifests itself, what the real risks are, and who is in danger of being radicalized by people who are not really nice. They're actually quite nasty. Molly, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, one of the problems with any conversation about terrorism or extreme political violence that causes terror, if I can put it that way, is definition. Um, where does right wing extremism sit in the continuum of all of the kinds of terror threats that we hear about today?
Absolutely. I think this is a crucial point to start at. And we've seen the debate about definitions for the Salafi jihadist terrorism and for other forms of terrorism really cause confusion in how to combat violent political movements. And so the right wing extremism or the racially and ethnically motivated terrorism, as it's often labeled here in the United States, this movement is not uniform, but those that make up the movement often adhere to some form of hatred towards minority or an outgroup. And this includes anti Semitism, xenophobia, Islamophobia. But as I mentioned, the milieu of ideologues, individuals, and groups that organize both online and offline and are part of this broad movement of right wing extremism, they are have overlapping but also fluid ideologies. So, for example, although they might in the core adhere to some form of violent racist ideology, they could also espouse hatred towards women uh, or people who identify as LGBTQ plus, and they can be anti-abortion and all of these things. But I think the key point here is that they are doing politically motivated violence, and these violent attacks can range from hate crimes to organized terrorist attacks.
If we can take the point you made earlier about the issues of racism, anti-Semitism, uh, and the issue of I guess if we can use an example, way back in after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan came along in the U.S.
Yes.
It was a direct a reaction um, by those who believed that the black population of the United States had a lower status than the white population of the United States. And the Ku Klux Klan came and went depending on the situation in the US. Is this the kind of thing we're talking about in today's right wing extremism, or is it something completely different and more insidious?
I think that the ideology and the narratives have existed for a long time, and I think what you're pointing out is part of the right wing extremist movement, which is white supremacy extremism, which is actually makes up the most lethal and most violence oriented groups in America adhere to white supremacy extremism. But I think that two crucial points that I would like to make on how this movement and this ideology is different today than it was a couple of decades ago, or even further back, like right after the Civil War. So the first one is that it is the biggest terrorism threat to the United States, and it is a rising threat in Europe and elsewhere, like Australia. For example, the UN has noted that over the last 5 years, there's been a 320% increase in terrorist attacks by groups or individuals who are affiliated with some form of right wing extremist movement or ideology. And in the US alone, between 2001 and 2016, over 70% of lethal violent extremist incidents were caused by individuals adhering to some form of far right violent extremist ideology. And you can compare that with, a little under 30% of attacks during the same time period were committed by Salafi jihadists. So to your point in the beginning, there is this notion that Salafi jihadist terrorism or global jihadi terrorism is the imminent, most important, potent terrorism threat to the Western world. That's no longer the case, and it hasn't been the case for a long time in the US. Similarly, in the UK, the head of the British counterterrorism police said last year that right wing extremism poses the fastest growing terrorism threat in the UK. So, first, I think we need to realize that this threat is very potent and it's here. And secondly, building off that point, why this threat is so lethal and why we need to start paying attention and how it has evolved since the early days is that we see a worrying trend in the similarities how white supremacists are organizing today to how jihadis were organizing in the lead up to 9/11 and beyond. So in short, they're taking, an already well developed and well tested terrorism playbook and more or less copying it. And a key part of this playbook is the transnational movement. And that means that although there might be domestic groups and individuals in, say, Australia or the US or Europe, they are connected in a broader network and they're financing, they're recruiting, they're organizing together to commit acts of violence against innocent individuals.
You've bundled a range of interesting issues in that last response, which probably need to be teased out. What do we know? And if we take the most recent report your organisation's put out, Mollie, which is the special report on the Atomwaffen Division, uh, it is interesting to hear that the this particular network, um, fluid though it may be, is borrowing directly from the way in which jihadists have been operating for a very long time. Um, what does that say about the capacity of organisations in, or illicit networks rather, to learn from others?
Indeed, it's a worrying trend when extremists start to learn from each other, but why reinvent the wheel when you can already do something that evidently works? And I think just to hone on this point for the audience in how similar, I think people like to think that you put Salafi jihadists on one end of the spectrum, and then you put right wing extremists or white supremacists on the other end of the spectrum, and they're really truly not that different in their worldview. Salafi jihadists, they fight for a religiously pure society while white supremacists fight for a racially pure society. Violence is the primary method to achieving their political goals. Both movements are utilizing social media to recruit or finance or spread their hateful creed. Jihadis, they publish martyrdom tapes, while white supremacists and other right wings extremists publish long manifestos online. And jihadis post beheading videos whilst white supremacists live stream their attacks, like in the awful Christchurch mosque shooting. And bringing it back to your point here in the U.S., this comparison even extends to the naming of groups within this movement. So neo-Nazis here in America has adopted the name The Base for one of their organizations. And that's literally a translation from Arabic of Al-Qaeda. And as we pointed out in our report, they're borrowing manuals. They're even glorifying Osama bin Laden in some of their propaganda posters. And most importantly, they are organizing in cell-like structures, so they're harder to disrupt. And a very worrying part of Atomwaffen specifically is, obviously their fascination with their accelerationist ideology that they're adhering to, which is basically that they want to bring about a holy race war in order to collapse modern society. And this is quite similar to the playbook that Al Qaeda and ISIS adhere to in the management of savagery, which is basically that you need to create, you use terrorism and political violence to create pockets of chaos that you can then govern. And this is exactly what Atomwaffen and groups like that want to achieve.
How do they go about recruiting people? What do they do? Because it's all very well for somebody to have an idea, right? If they're out there sitting on their own, it might be a bad idea, but they're only thinking it themselves. Okay. So, how do these guys start to get other people joining them? How does the network form? What have you observed?
So it is interesting in the specific aspect of Atomwaffen, which I think signifies a broader trend within the right-wing extremists and white supremacy transnational movement. So Atomwaffen was born out of an online fascist forum called Iron March. So it was from the beginning wholly organized online. However, it doesn't take much to go from the online to the physical space and starting to organize there. And in terms of recruitment, in order to achieve their goal that we've spoken about, the race war that they want to bring about, they focus their recruitment a lot on either former or active duty military officers or other people with combat experience, because they're very fascinated and they think it's very important to have paramilitary training and understand the tactics of guerrilla warfare and modern urban warfare and so forth. So, and then secondly, they're very much interested in recruiting as young as possible. And so we see a very disturbing evidence of white supremacists using gaming culture to recruit young individuals, and I'm talking about our children. One member of an Atomwaffen Division spin-off group or inspired group in the Baltic states, Krieg Division, he was 13 years old.
It So there's a 13-year-old that is, or that was, plugging into this extreme right wing group.
Yes.
That seems bizarre. It's plausible, but it seems really, really bizarre and concerning.
It is incredibly concerning because obviously, if you are younger, you're more impressionable. And if this is the reality we're living in today, especially taking into consideration the global pandemic we're in the midst of, which means that most of our children and young adolescents are wholly online, either for school or for social networking with their friends or for gaming, which seems very innocent. But who are they talking to, and what are these people from across the world saying? I'll take an example. There's a popular gaming community chat application called Discord, and it was leveraged by Atomwaffen specifically and other white supremacists to communicate bomb making manuals, plot violence act at the Unite the Right rally, which killed one person. And they also, praised murders by other white supremacists. And before Discord shut down their communications, in this was in February of 2018, members of Atomwaffen had exchanged more than 250,000 messages on this gaming chat application. Um, and gaming has exploded significantly during COVID-19. Over a 1 week period in late March, when most of the pandemic hit the Western world, 4.3 million video games were sold worldwide. So the point is, they have a very captive audience, and we need to understand how the recruitment tactics of these groups are working now, which is, targeting people with active or who have combat experience and targeting young people. And that's where we need to put our countermeasures and countering messaging efforts in.
It's it, as you speak, it resonated that analogy between what jihadists had done over a great many years starts to resonate because there's a vulnerability out there at the moment with COVID. People don't know what's happening. Somebody comes along and starts to uh, offer them some kind of, well, let's loosely call it some kind of leadership,
Mm,
um, or some kind of clear vision, some kind of explanation of the world with which they can connect and then engage. Um, it seems to me what jihadist advocates had done and drawn various younger individuals into their net, if you like. I mean, you don't get 19 people walking on planes and a 9/11 just happening overnight, right? Um, and this is the kind of thing you're warning about in the case of Atomwaffen Division, particularly, aren't you?
absolutely. And you know, again, bringing it back to the type of world we're living in today, um, the COVID-19 pandemic, with the political, economic fallout and the human toll that this global pandemic has put on us, this crisis, you say the bigger the crisis, the bigger the opportunities from extremists from, you know, all spectrum, the whole spectrum to recruit and radicalize. And I think that, we're not even halfway through this pandemic yet. And when we look back, I think that we will see this as a watershed moment for the recruitment of white supremacists or other right wing extremists. And the scary part is that what happens in the online space can very easily manifest into physical attacks. And we've already seen that here in the United States with individuals attempting to perpetrate attacks from New York to Missouri to Los Angeles. And I worry that this is just the beginning.
How do you get to? I mean, if we've looked at Atomwaffen Division a bit, but there are other extremist groups in the US and other extremist ideologies that tend to, uh, I guess we could say, that tend to be exported elsewhere. I mean, Australia has seen its fair share of sovereign citizen movement types emerge from under rocks during the uh, COVID-19 pandemic, where they think compliance with the laws of the state is a bit like walking into a restaurant and picking and choosing stuff from the lunch buffet, right? Um, and you've got your own sovereign citizen types in the US. What are your observations about the way in which those guys have conducted themselves during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, as we were saying in the beginning, right wing extremism is not a unified movement, and there are plenty of different ideologies or narratives that you can tap into to justify your own worldview. And COVID is, providing another layer to that. And what I think we're seeing here, which is something that, sovereign citizens or or people who adhere to, uh, anti-feminism or anti-LGBTQ or anti-Black Lives Matter um, ideology. What we're seeing here is also this disinformation terrorism nexus happening, which is, you know, essentially um, there are these conspiracy theories that are now providing evidence to this broad movement, whatever you're believing in, whatever hateful creed you think justifies your worldview. A lot of the disinformation surrounding COVID-19, whether it's anti-vax um, or QAnon, or which is basically this conspiracy about there's this elite cult which is Satan worshiping and drinking the blood of our children, which to you and me sounds completely ludicrous, but it's now become this global movement of conspiracy theories. You know, this all provides evidence for extremist hateful views and hateful creed, and this becomes a very dangerous and violent cocktail that could explode at any minute. And there's also something to be said about right-wing extremist ideologue in the United States and movements in the United States now being exported abroad, which you are seeing in Australia. And that's also a very dangerous element. And what it means in theory is that, we have the Five Eye countries, and who have successfully cooperated on intelligence sharing and law enforcement mechanisms to combat Salafi jihadist terrorism. And this apparatus, which has been so masterfully crafted after 9/11 and the horrid attacks in Europe that followed, this apparatus now also needs to focus on white supremacy extremism and other forms of racially and ethnically motivated violence to keep citizens safe.
What are the other kinds of groups that you're seeing in the US at the moment that are of concern to you? Because there might be things that you're seeing that we're not seeing down here, and it'll be useful to have an early warning, Molly.
No, absolutely. I, I think, for example, that acceleration accelerationist white supremacy organizations like Atomwaffen and the Base, who have these transnational networks, they're definitely interested in the um, New Zealand and Australian market, and I know that they've actively promoting white nationalists and so forth from Australia. Just today, I looked at a post on an encrypted chat forum that says, from Australia, our activists capture LGBTQ material, and it's a very derogatory photo, and urging followers to follow, quote, follow our comrades in the Pacific Patriots Front, and linking to their encrypted chat forum. So Australia and New Zealand are definitely, desired grounds for the transnational network to take root. And secondly, married again with these conspiracy theories that are largely driven by modern disinformation. Um, you know, QAnon is now a global movement, and that needs to be considered and taken into account. And there already here in the United States been, individuals trying to perpetrate attacks in the name of QAnon, or the conspiracy rather. So that is another point. Again, the radicalization of young and active duty military or armed service members is also something that I think is a trend that Australia and Australian law enforcement and intelligence should take into account. And last but not least, um, just like Salafi jihadists have traveled to conflicts in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, and the Balkans in the 90s, and Iraq and Syria now most recently, and you have had Australians who've traveled over there to join ISIS, for example. But white supremacists are also doing the same. They are traveling to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, and by our latest account, over 17,000 foreigners traveled over there, Nine of those, at least nine of those, were Australians. And that's a very worrisome trend in the sense that if you go there, you can gain active combat experience, you can further solidify your network. And when you return to your group at home, say in Australia, you can instruct them in knowledge transfer of making bombs or paramilitary tactics or whatnot. And you also have a lot of street cred because you got active combat experience. You went there and you were a fighter. So it's important to track these individuals, and I know there's been reports about this in the Australian media about individuals who went over, but it's important to understand what they're doing today, who they're organizing with, and what they're planning.
It actually paints a pretty bleak picture when we talk about this. But what you're actually flagging to people in Australia is that a lot of thinking needs to happen, not just in law enforcement, not just in the intelligence community, but also in the homes of families where you've got people who are focused on gaming who might have some curious interests. Because how do you deal with that counter-terrorism element, if you like, where you minimise or attempt to minimise the likelihood of people being radicalised by some of this stuff?
No, I mean this is a $1 million question, right? And unfortunately, there's no cookie cutter approach because at this point, if there was, we would have solved the radicalization question, not only for the Salafi jihadists, but also for the white supremacists. But
Yeah.
I think first and foremost, recognizing that this is not a domestic threat. A lot of people like to label right-wing extremism as domestic terrorism. No, it is a transnational movement. It's a transnational threat, and realizing that also helps you protect your family, help you protect yourself online against global narratives that feed into this violent and hateful ideology. And that also helps, law enforcement and intelligence and academia and think tanks to understand how to study this threat or how to combat this threat if you're law enforcement and intelligence. And for the law enforcement intelligence, it is about sharing intelligence with our partners, across nations and states. And for academia and think tanks, same thing, sharing best practices and talking about what's happening in your country, how's the movement manifesting there, and what are the connections that they're having to my country, and so forth. So it sounds cliche, but I think awareness is key first and foremost, and then we can start implementing. Once we recognize the threat, we can start implementing countermeasures.
One of the curious things I've noticed uh, in the COVID pandemic paralysis that people are in different parts of the world is the way in which certain subcultures, the Quanon type subculture or the ideology, and the other sort of sovereign citizen ideologies have sprung pretty quickly or have been adopted by people through social media, particularly Facebook, is where I've noticed it. Um, uh, to what extent do you think uh, organizations like Facebook and similar social media platforms have a responsibility to keep an eye on what's happening on their platforms and how these ideas are being exchanged?
I think that social media platforms and networking platforms absolutely bear an incredible responsibility in combating hate and violent narratives on their platforms. And, um, you know, as you point to, there's been an exponential growth in sovereign citizens, militias organizing online on, say, Facebook. Same with QAnon groups. It's just increased explosively throughout the course of the pandemic. And although Facebook has taken measures to take down um, groups that are organizing violence or counter protestings in a violent manner, and QAnon supporting groups. It happened a little bit too late, and this becomes the questions of these algorithms. We've seen over and over again, and we're very well aware that you can easily move from conspiracy theory or one sort of ideologue into a rabbit hole that quickly leads to radicalization, thanks to the algorithms developed by these social media platforms that are intended for good and intended for pointing you in a direction of what you might be interested in. But if you are interested in something that's fringe and maybe violent, it quickly leads down this rabbit hole of rapid radicalization that may take you from the online to the physical sphere very, very quickly. And so it is, and I think the key point here is that social media companies are profiting off these algorithms because that's how they sell advertising spots to big companies. So it is up to them to, figure out how to not profit off hate and not, use, prevent these algorithms from actually leading to violence. And I don't think that they've done enough, and I don't think that they've come far enough. And I think that it's important that they work with the government, that they work with other private sector or not-for-profit groups to understand how radicalization happens online. And they're getting there, but they're nowhere near enough efforts made.
There's another thing I forgot to mention in my sort of analysis of social media platforms. I read a disturbing paper today, actually, in preparation for our chat, uh, about the fact that uh, the warm and fuzzy TikTok, the platform that we get Donald Trump impersonations on that people laugh at, is being used by extremist groups, you know, that sit to the right of Genghis Khan, to promote their own ideologies, to promote their own imagery, to promote their own messaging. Um, it, it doesn't make TikTok look like a fun place, to be honest.
No, and I've read similar reports to you, and it's very disturbing because you think about what is the average age group of individuals who are on this platform TikTok, and it goes back to a point I made earlier when we were talking about specific tactics of recruitment of these organizations like Atomwaffen and other white supremacist organizations. They want to target as young as possible, and TikTok, like gaming, is a primary place for this. So again, although no technology like social media networking is created, it's not inherently good or bad. It's not created as an evil mechanism for terrorists to radicalize, but it's utilized by evil and rogue actors, states and non-state actors alike. Um, and if you've created something, you also need to figure out how to make sure that you know your platform cannot be used to coordinate or organize and conduct violent attacks against innocent civilians.
The one thing that keeps coming up in what we're saying is uh, the notion of risk management, the notion of awareness. In the case of Salafi jihadists, uh, there are things that make them look different to, for example, a predominantly white society. Uh, is the inability of people to see the threat of right wing extremists um, something that comes from an inability to believe that people who look like us in inverted commas, aren't capable of that kind of um, degree of violence or degree of hatred?
Absolutely, the in-group, out-group mentality is obviously, a part of the psychology behind understanding and realizing the extent of the threat here. But as I pointed out, white supremacists or other right-wing extremists, they're not that different in their ideology and their tactics and their strategy from Salafi jihadists. And in my opinion, there is no difference between a white supremacist traveling from, say, Australia to go and fight with a ultra nationalist um, volunteer battalion in the eastern part of Ukraine, compared to an Australian going and fighting with ISIS. They learn the same things. They're um, equally radicalized, and they pose an equal threat when they return home. And so, and I think that one thing that has scarred me, especially looking at these organizations, another example is their hatred towards women. You know, women have a very specific place in this, distorted view of how society should look like. That isn't that different from how a Salafi jihadist views the female role. You're supposed to be traditional, modest, serving the man, and bearing children. And if you don't do that, violence is justified, rape is justified, murder is justified. And that really hit home for me.
It's a frightening prospect. We've taken the listeners through some really really uh, dark territory, um, but it's necessary to go there because I think people need to be shaken out of their complacency. That's certainly what our securities agencies are doing here. Uh, Molly, before we wrap the conversation up, there's a lot of work that the Soufan Center does in relation to analysis. You publish various in kind of intelligence brief, bottom line up front briefs on your website, but there's also research you've done, such as the material we've spoken about uh, on white supremacy, extremism, available. Where can people go and find this material?
Absolutely. For those who are interested in learning more, and also, I know that this conversation has been quite dark, but we also have solutions that are outlined, and policy recommendations that are outlined in our research, um, that hopefully can help to alleviate this threat. So you can find it online on our website, thesoufancenter.org. And there you have research, intelligence briefings, special events. We also host webinars on these topics with experts from the Soufan Center, but also within our network more broadly. And it is a great place to learn more about this threat and what you can do to combat it, and what law enforcement, intelligence, and policymakers can also do.
Molly, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to someone who's across what is an important um, uh, topic in today's environment, particularly in Australia, with people looking at anti-vaxxers and others uh, in the midst of COVID, who are running strange ideas up polls, hoping that they'd get more adherence in a time of stress. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And for the listeners out there, visit the Soufan Center website. They've got a detailed research on far right extremism and other areas of interest. It's worth your effort. Stay safe and look after each other. And I'll be back again soon with another podcast.